So these are measurements, y'all. Two brand new species of these crocodiles being caught. So it's two species of crocodile that had any indication of what that structure might be, or something that I could have gone towards, is this one. And I'll be honest with you, Spartacus, I don't know if you can straight up tell what that little goofy line is. It, in fact, was confusing enough to me to see this kind of figure because it looks like this is just like offset and not flat. Same with this and these two. And it is true, they're not actually flat. They're not supposed to be. But at first glance, I was like, what is going on here? Nose hair. So Anders, good point. Mustache, hairpin, plug. So, Jaded, what if I were to tell you that the image that you're seeing here is actually the underside of a jawbone? What would you say to that? Jaded Fairy would look at me and go, which is fair. This here is the side of a skull. Outside of a skull here. All right. Top view of the skull. This is overhead, your ventral view. No, sorry, your dorsal view, top view. And these dots here, this side of the skull, are what are represented here amongst a couple of different existing species of animals. Now, ones that matter here are these. So this is a graph called a principal component analysis. And why these are done is that it's a way to track variance. So what feature explains the variance of what we see in a graph? And in a graph, that could be data set of measurements that you've taken of a certain kind of animal. In this instance here, these are measurements of, we've got some people saying alligator and some people saying crocodile. So these are measurements, y'all. I'm going to go ahead and grab the image of two brand new species of, hold on. Hold, please. There we go. Now we see it. Look at that. So in their press releases, they had some images of them actually capturing the gators, but even deep within the supplement, I couldn't find any of these crocodiles being caught. So it's two species of crocodile that were identified. The way to tell it apart, Neil, I think that you must have caught it. The curvature on the tip of the nose. That curvature of the tip of the nose points you towards crocodile, where if it's more narrow, it points you towards alligator. So those are the differences. So we'll go through the paper. We'll go through some of the figures as well. This was a different flavor of new species of the week than what we usually go through. So normally the new species of the week that we end up talking about is very much on the measurement side of things, where it's measuring different structures, different features of the animal, and trying to compare and contrast those between existing animals to identify what's new. And Sparky Pugwash, you have hit a very critical component. They did a lot of genetic sequencing on this. A lot of genetic sequencing. Now, Spartacus, before we get into the sequencing, let's go over where they found these animals, because I feel like Sparky Pugwash, actually they've got a nice graphical abstract too. We can go over that. So this is one of my favorite parts of any paper when it's required, and I like it better to be required if possible because it makes it easier. This is called a graphical abstract. And so this is basically telling us exactly what they did. The new species of the week, chat. The new species of the week. I guess we have these two brand new species of crocodile. And where these crocodilians are from. So why I thought this was really cool is because the location in which the university that was leading the study is actually in Canada, McGill University. And they collaborated with researchers down in Mexico. I don't know what drove them to have interest in it, but I really like that collaboration, that it's continental, like cross, because they also went to a bunch of different sub islands as well, right? And so what they ended up finding is they found one new species of crocodile that lived on an island called Cozumel, and the other is an atoll called Banco Chinchorro. Both of these islands are off the coast of the Yucatán Peninsula, and we'll actually get around here. We'll go in and show you all closer on a map. And they did sequencing on the animals. They actually did specimen collection from a bunch of neighboring species as well. So they compared sequences from the Caribbean, Central America, Pacific coast, and they were looking for genetic similarities or differences. Sparky, when your question comes for this zone here, right, did they do sequencing? And what was the result of it? They had a bunch of comparative genetics between established, known, and identified existing species. I really like how this figure is laid out, is because you can see exactly what they did. They did tissue collection of 143 crocodiles, spanning all those locations we just said. They extracted DNA from them. They did not sack the animal. They just extracted DNA. They took some measurements as well, so it's geometric measurements of the skulls, and then they analyzed the data. And the question is, all right, is it something new? or is it something that we've already seen before, right? Pretty straightforward of a setup. Really surprised that they found new species of these crocodilians, I think. Yes, and Sparky, it is a continuation of the continent of North America. Yep. So Spartacus, right down here, the next little landmass would be South America. That's right at your cutoff point, right at that tip of green between the two continents. So these are all the sample collection spots, Spartacus. And what you can see here is in the green, they actually did go into South America as well. So that green zone there is your beginning looks into the South American specimens as well. And there was mention of the North American crocodile too. So this is an interesting paper insofar as it's similar to the one that we looked at a few weeks ago that was identifying a new species kind of for the sake of biodiversity with the giraffes. Here, they're using genetics of these crocodile populations and doing a compare and contrast. And what they're looking for is levels of genetic differentiation. And so Neilf has a great question. If their data would be able to pick up hybrids. So Neilf, with their replicate number, what their hypothesis was that there would be a brand new, or there would be no new crocodile, but there would be just variants of the American crocodile. So that was the expectation of their expectation. And what they find is that there's so many genetic differences in the data that there is no way to explain it with just being hybrids or with being just weird variation that is being seen just because of, like, again, some genetic isolation or some interbreeding. Seems like it's not enough. All right, so bring back up the figure, y'all. There we go. So these are the locations where they were studying. So Neil, there were so many individuals that were sampled that they would have the resolution to be able to tell if there were hybrids forming. And because the hybrids would be considered as not a rapid, like a drastic enough variance. You'd basically be getting from the, like, let's say the 3 different species, you'd be getting something that's like mixed together, and that would be representative in the data. So even accounting for that, they found that these 2 new species of crocodiles were so different that they were able to identify them as very, very different creatures. So they looked at genetic sequences from populations of these 2 new locations of crocodile, and they compared them, like we said, to the Caribbean, Central America, and the Pacific coast. For Cozumel, and here we go, I will put it into the chat because I apologize, Neil, if my pronunciation is most likely not correct, but it is those 2 locations. They're both islands off the coast of Yucatan. And so the neat part is the hypothesis, right, Neil, is that these animals were probably from that isolated population, right? That they had just been land isolated millions of years ago, and that's when they've diverged. And Neil, if you can also imagine that having it be on a really small island comes with a lot of issues. These 2 islands, Cozumel and Bancho Chirono, are where the 2 new species of crocodilians were found. Now, here's the catch, y'all. They have actually done a population count to see how many individuals there are. And y'all may have already guessed it, there's less than 1,000 breeding individuals here. So both populations seem to be stable. They did a little bit of horizontal testing to see like what genetics are represented. And it seems like in the gene pool, it's pretty normalized right now. However, the islands are under threat of deforestation, pollution, you name it. And so both numbers, because they're limited and because the habitat is so restricted in terms of size, they are now considered to be as vulnerable species. So why is it important to define them as new species? Because if we don't, there's going to be no protections being put in on them. So this is actually the same reason as to why, remember, it was so important that the different giraffe species were identified as actual different species and not subspecies. Otherwise, they don't get that protection level. And so here on these 2 islands, the long-standing theory had just been they are just variants. And it turns out they're not variants. There are 2 brand new species of crocodile. So Sparky, that is how they'll actually get funding protection, or at least a label of protection on the animals, which prevents people from deforesting the entire island, is having that application, that characterization applied to the animals. So yeah, one of the reasons why this is so important of identifying these different species is just for preservation as well. And there's no naming yet of these new species. So even though they are brand new, they've been identified not to just be variants of the existing American crocodile. There's no name yet for the 2 new species. I'm not sure if they will be, opening it up for a naming system or anything. They probably won't. It'll probably be some benefactor, whatnot, but still, it's interesting that they haven't named it yet. but they've gone through, I think the methodology was really nice. This time they went through and like tell you each replicate number of the American crocodile versus the new crocodilians as well, what they ended up looking at, and where they were located from too. So here we have a little bit of numbers of the samplings and the locations of where they've done. So they tried to vary the populations too. So Neilf, this is getting to Neilf's question. Neilf, it was very important that when they did this research, for how you asked if they were just looking at accidental variances, like, or hybrids that have popped up, how to actually counteract that effect. So the way that they knew that it wasn't a hybrid is because they looked across a large geographic range. If they would have just tested into one zone, right, of, let's say, the Yucatán Peninsula for one of the species instead of looking at it from a couple of different sites, then you could have very easily the argument that this isn't the appropriate test, right? Because then you'd be leaving out a whole region of the population that could be accounting for some of the differences that you're seeing. But they had a very, very nice spread, and so I think the really nice spread was a fun takeaway to what the research ended up being. That's a great question. We'll scroll through the rest of the paper, but there was no evolutionary hypothesis put into place as to why there was geographical isolation there, and or how they got there. The interesting thing too is, Neil, that these species had diverged significantly millions of years ago, and they did say in the paper there has been no gene flow in between these islands, or between the island and the mainland. They're only 20 miles offshore. Yeah, so Neil, that's really interesting, because again, like in the paper, they were saying they're not having gene flow between the islands, or from the island to the mainland, right? So that's even more interesting when you take into account, right, that, so again, back to the paper. So Gene Tree, they discovered 2 new species, brand new species of crocodilians. They are 2 off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. So they are in the island of Cozumel, and the other is on an atoll of Bancho Chinchorro. So both of them are off the Yucatan Peninsula. There's both islands have about 1,000 individuals remaining. They are small islands, so it makes sense that there's not a lot of individuals there. And they did some genetic testing and showed that the populations are in fact stable. So there's not like an increase or decline that's actively going on. They're just living. So they're still putting them. They can't list them as endangered yet. They can only put them as vulnerable, and the only reason they were able to put them as vulnerable is because of their habitat. If they were on a bigger island and had a higher population, then they wouldn't be able to list them as vulnerable. They would have to list them as not even threatened even. But in this instance here, they had enough evidence where they could be like, all right, there is something that should be protected with them, which is important anyway, but it was because of the island size that they were able to do this. But they looked at the geometric shapes and differences of the animals to do a little bit of compare and contrast as well. And they've got, again, a nice set of numbers and replicate numbers that they had from a different sets of these populations. Here we've got the structure plots. So this is looking at how dense and how the populations are operating and what they're operating like. And so they're showing there's hold on, I'm going to make sure I get it right. The light orange bars right here, and then the light blue are here. So those are the 2 new populations there. See, what is a group of alligators crocodiles called? I'm not sure. Mel. Population more at risk due to mangrove loss of development, but they do have the protected zones. They didn't go into any differentiation between the 2 of them, Neilf. They were just saying that I think the reason why they didn't go into which one is at most risk is currently because all the populations are being maintained and they're pretty steady. And that's just looking at genetic drift and change over time. There wasn't much variance in between them. Some evidence of gene flow, especially with like the shift of the oranges here between it. But otherwise, the orange is very, very much a clear population. So What's weird, Neil, is they said in the paper there was no movement between islands. However, if you look at this figure, it does suggest that there is at least some movement going on. The 2 stars, weirdly enough, they highlight, what about what the green is? Yeah, I don't have a clarification as to what this green is here. But these are the 2 species that are brand new. Let's actually just open it up. Here we go. So if we look, these are the two species right here, the orange and this purple. And so those are have very little gene flow between them. The orange one is near none. And then this one right here, there's a little bit of gene flow from this population here. But almost no gene flow is happening between our two island populations. Some of the other ones, so Neil, this will be looking at like different states of hybrids, right? This is what you would predict to see if there were some hybrids within the population. This is actually one of those sampled. This is can't read what the sites are, but this 50-50 here is an example of your hybrid. And so that's what you would expect to see, Neil, in these two, if it was just that it was hybrids forming. But because those two, that orange and that purple right here, so these are the two new species, because of those, there's not any other color coming in. That's why it's suspected that they're not actually hybrids coming in. Does that make sense? Just by looking at those colors. Just a wild guess that they had one time in the mainland, but that population became extinct due to massive coastal development. If I recall correctly, about 60 miles apart. 200 years ago, they would have been on the mainland, would explain the gene flow. Interesting, Neil. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, this spans back longer. So if we look and see this next figure, Neil, here we go. These are the new species that were identified. So it's, again, all part of this radiation where the American crocodile is located. And this is the most recent common ancestor, and we're going back millions of years for it. So it looks like they've been on this island for a long time. And what about that island has made them as such to differentiate? It's hard to know. Beyond just like, you know, the isolation of it. And then this is the figure that we started off with today, y'all. This is looking at the differences in that dorsal skull view and seeing what the differences are in shape and showing that the new species are functionally distinct. So that's that pink here. And because of that, they're a brand new species. That's another example. It's tying that together with the genetics. That's demonstrating to us that, yes, these are in fact brand new animals. And two brand new, in fact, of them. It's not a reclassification. It is, in fact, two brand new organisms. The supplement is also here, y'all. There was not much in the supplementary. They had this nicer outline of the crocodilian skull drawn out, and beyond that, they had, again, just a lot of more metrics in terms of some morphology, so some structural information, some looking at the differences in the genetics, and then they also tucked away the supplementary table 5 of one of the crocodile species and how big the clutch sizes were. So how big it was, like each nest, and how many eggs were laid. They didn't go anywhere with that. It was just, I felt like a nice little bit of extra information that they had in the paper. But it was fun, I thought. Differences between alligator and crocodile came up to be two brand new species of crocodile, again, off the coast of the Yucatán Peninsula. The figures were really nice in that we saw exactly where the 170 plus samples were collected from, where they were originally located, what the genetic drift is between the two populations that are new, along with the mainland populations. And then also they had this whole take on the need for conservation of these animals. So they did, again, sampling. They found about 1,000 animals on each island as the estimate, and they can list them as the vulnerable because of the island size. If the island had been different, they wouldn't have been able to, but they're now able to get that beginnings of protecting the organism. Yeah, so they're able to begin the protection work going in, Sparky, for these animals. And so that was our first new species of the week, was these beautiful here, let me go to the top back up, these beautiful crocodilians. Two brand new ones, Sparky Pugwash. But there we go. Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing, Neil. And Neil, what I thought was really, really interesting, the start of the paper, it was a negative hypothesis. And this is what I think Jay Spites would find cool too, is that their hypothesis was that there's not a lot of differences. They went in with the mindset of, we want to see what are the differences between these populations, and we're not predicting there to be much, that they're all just kind of a homogeneous population. And then all of a sudden, they actually do the experiments, like, wait a minute, no, these are all very, very different animals. And I thought that was a really, really cool take, that from that analysis came these two brand new species. And again, I think this is a really nice figure to illustrate it, right? Those two stars down below for the two new species, not a lot of different color there, barely a speck of green color here, just a speck of it. But no, Jay, the reason I'm surprised is because they could have just as easily changed the hypothesis at the beginning of this paper and been like, we are just gonna go up and say we thought there were new species, and they don't, right? They straight up said in their paper, they're like, we didn't think that there would be a difference, and yet we found a difference. And so that's what I thought was really, really cool, is that because the story could have been framed very differently and we wouldn't have been the wiser, but it's just a neat takeaway to it. And then it also showed a neat collaboration between Canada and Mexico to find these new species. So that's our first paper of the day.